Thomas had never been one for animals. He didn't dislike them, but he simply never saw the point of keeping one. He had lived his life in a quiet, practical manner, working long days in his blacksmith shop, returning home to a simple supper, and spending the evenings in solitude. His wife, Margaret, had been the one who loved animals. She used to feed stray cats that wandered near their cottage, talking to them as if they understood every word. But after she passed, Thomas let the house fall silent, unwilling to fill the space she left behind with anything else. It was on a bitter autumn evening when fate intervened. The sky was heavy with rain, and the wind howled through the trees as Thomas walked home from the village. As he passed a narrow alley near the market, a faint whimper caught his ear. He paused, frowning. The sound was weak, almost drowned out by the storm, but there it was again, a desperate, pitiful cry. With a sigh, he stepped into the alley, his boots squelching in the mud. Under a broken wooden crate, shivering and soaked to the bone, lay a tiny, scrappy-looking pup. Its fur was a mess of dark and light patches, its ribs faintly visible beneath its wet coat. The little creature barely lifted its head, exhausted from the cold. Thomas hesitated. He could just leave it. Someone else might take it in. But then, he thought of Margaret, how she would have scolded him for thinking such a thing. With a reluctant grunt, he crouched down and scooped the trembling pup into his arms. "Blast it all," he muttered. "You better not be trouble." The pup didn't resist. It was too weak to protest, merely curling into the warmth of Thomas's coat as he carried it home. Back at the cottage, Thomas wrapped the little thing in an old woolen blanket by the fire. The pup's eyes, large and round, watched him with a quiet curiosity. Thomas busied himself with drying off and rummaging for food, though he wasn't even sure what puppies ate. He settled on soaking a piece of bread in warm milk, placing it in front of his unexpected guest. To his surprise, the pup perked up at the scent and devoured the meal with a desperate hunger. Thomas shook his head. "You eat like an old drunkard," he murmured. "Like Murphy from the tavern, always making a mess, always begging for more." The name stuck. "Murphy it is, then," he said, rubbing a hand over his face. He couldn't believe he was doing this, naming a stray, keeping it in his home. But as Murphy, full at last, stretched out in front of the fire with a contented sigh, Thomas felt an unfamiliar warmth creep into his chest. The days that followed were full of challenges. Thomas had never cared for an animal before, and Murphy had never known a steady home. They had to learn each other's ways, and neither was particularly patient. Murphy had a habit of following Thomas everywhere, underfoot in the kitchen, at his heels in the workshop, even trying to climb onto his lap when he sat in his chair. Thomas grumbled about it, but secretly he didn't mind. The first real argument came when Murphy chewed through one of Thomas's boots. Furious, Thomas scolded him, pointing at the destroyed leather. "That's my best pair, you little menace," he barked. Murphy, thoroughly unimpressed, gave a small huff and plopped down stubbornly. Thomas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You're trouble, aren't you?" he muttered. But trouble or not, Murphy stayed. Over time, Murphy grew stronger, and Thomas grew softer. He started saving scraps from his dinner for the pup, grumbling all the while. He even found himself talking to Murphy, though he'd never admit it. "You're getting fat," he'd say as Murphy sprawled across his feet. "And you snore louder than a grown man." Murphy would wag his tail unconcerned. As the weeks passed, Thomas realized something strange. His evenings weren't quite as empty anymore. The cottage didn't feel so silent. When he reached down absent-mindedly and felt Murphy's warm fur beneath his fingers, he understood. He wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't so bad. The days turned to weeks, and Murphy became more than just a stray pup Thomas had taken in. He became his shadow. Whether in the cottage, the blacksmith shop, or even on his quiet walks into the village, the little dog was never far from his side. Thomas had spent years moving through life in solitude, resigned to the quiet since Margaret's passing. But Murphy disrupted that solitude in ways Thomas never expected. It didn't take long for Murphy to claim his place in Thomas's blacksmith shop. At first, Thomas tried to keep him out, worried about the heat of the forge and the clang of metal disturbing the pup. "You'll burn your fool tail off in here," he muttered the first time Murphy tried to follow him inside. Murphy, of course, ignored him completely. Every morning he trotted after Thomas, tail wagging as if to say, "This is where I belong, and we both know it." Eventually, Thomas gave up trying to keep him out. Murphy found his own spot, a cozy little corner away from the flames, where he could still watch Thomas work. He'd rest his chin on his paws, ears twitching with every hammer strike, his eyes never leaving his master. The villagers who came for horseshoes, tools, and repairs quickly grew used to the sight of the scrappy dog lying in the shop, his presence as much a fixture as the anvil itself. "That pup's got more patience than you do, Thomas," old Mr. Calloway chuckled one day. Thomas only grumbled, but he reached down to ruffle Murphy's fur all the same. After long days in the shop, Thomas had always returned to an empty home, heating a bowl of stew in silence before turning in early. But now, his evenings had changed. After supper, Murphy would trot over to Thomas's chair by the fire and sit expectantly, ears perked. At first, Thomas hadn't understood. "What do you want, eh?" he muttered, peering down at the pup. Murphy simply wagged his tail and waited. Eventually, Thomas realized. Murphy wanted to be near him. He wanted Thomas to talk. So Thomas did. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Murphy listened without interrupting. Or maybe it was just that it felt natural. He spoke about the mundane things, the work he'd done that day, the stubbornness of some customers, the weather. And then, without meaning to, he found himself talking about Margaret. "You would have liked her," he said one evening, absently scratching behind Murphy's ears. "She'd have spoiled you rotten, always had a soft spot for strays." Murphy, as always, listened. And so, a new ritual was born. Every night after the fire was lit, Thomas would talk, and Murphy would listen. It was a quiet companionship, one neither of them had realized they needed. Murphy's attachment to Thomas ran deep, but it became most apparent one afternoon when Thomas had to make a trip to the next village for supplies. It was only a half-day's journey, but he decided it would be easier to leave Murphy behind. "You'll be fine for a few hours," he said, patting the dog's head before heading out. "Don't cause trouble." When Thomas returned, he found Murphy sitting by the front door, eyes fixed on the road. The moment he saw Thomas, he let out a high-pitched whine and ran to him, circling his feet in frantic excitement. Thomas scoffed, shaking his head. "Fool dog, I was gone for half a day," he muttered, but there was something warm in his voice. That night, Murphy refused to leave his side. He curled up at Thomas's feet, his little body pressed close, as if making sure Thomas wouldn't disappear again. Thomas sighed, reaching down to ruffle his fur. All right, he murmured. "I get it. I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in years, Thomas felt something he had forgotten, what it was like to be needed, to be missed. Murphy wasn't just some stray he'd taken in. He was family. By the time winter set in, Murphy and Thomas were inseparable. The once reluctant blacksmith no longer questioned the dog's place in his life. It wasn't just that Murphy followed him everywhere. It was that Thomas had come to expect it, to rely on it. Their days settled into a rhythm, one so natural that Thomas never thought to question it. Every morning, as the first light crept over the hills, Thomas and Murphy set off for the village. It was a simple routine. Thomas would collect his supplies, exchange a few words with the shopkeepers, and Murphy would trot beside him, tail wagging at every familiar face. The townsfolk had come to adore the little dog, greeting him almost as warmly as they did Thomas. "Morning, Murphy. called the baker, tossing him a bit of bread. "Keeping Thomas in line, are you?" the butcher teased, offering a scrap of dried meat. Murphy accepted each gift with a dignified air, as if it were his rightful due. Thomas shook his head, but never stopped them. "You're going to get fat if you keep this up," he muttered one morning. Murphy only wagged his tail, content. After their morning walk, the two would return to the forge, where Murphy would take his usual spot in the corner. He never got too close to the fire, but he watched Thomas work with unwavering interest. Sometimes, when the hammer struck particularly hard, Murphy would let out a small bark, as if offering his own opinion on the work. "You got something to say about my craftsmanship?" Thomas chuckled one afternoon. Murphy only tilted his head. Even customers noticed their bond. "That dog's more devoted to you than any apprentice I've seen," an old farmer remarked one day. Thomas only grunted in response, but there was an undeniable truth in the man's words. If their days were built on routine, their evenings were sacred. After supper, they would settle in by the fire. Thomas in his chair, Murphy curled at his feet. Thomas had never been much of a storyteller, but somehow, talking to Murphy came easily. He would ramble about his day, about memories of his younger years, about Margaret, and Murphy would listen, always. One night, after an especially long silence, Thomas exhaled and ran a hand through Murphy's fur. "I never thought I'd get used to this," he admitted. "Never thought I'd want company again." Murphy shifted closer, resting his head against Thomas's boot. "You're a stubborn one," Thomas muttered. "Not sure how you managed it, but I suppose you've grown on me?" Murphy let out a soft sigh, and Thomas smiled. As the months passed, their routine became more than just habit. It became something unshakable, something permanent. Thomas had spent so many years believing that love and companionship were things of the past, ghosts he had left behind with Margaret. But Murphy had proven him wrong. Because love wasn't always grand or spoken aloud. Sometimes it was simply walking the same path together day after day, never questioning if the other would be there. And Murphy? He knew in that deep instinctual way that dogs do, that this was his home, that Thomas was his. Neither of them said it, but neither of them needed to. Winter had settled in deep, laying a thick blanket of snow over the village and surrounding hills. The air was sharp with frost, and the forge fire burned longer these days to keep Thomas's hands from stiffening in the cold. Murphy, his thick coat now fully grown in, took to curling up near the heat, his ears twitching at every familiar clang of the hammer. It was a harsh season, but for Thomas and Murphy, life carried on as usual, until the first signs of trouble appeared. It started with a cough, a deep rattling sound that Thomas ignored at first. It was just the cold, he told himself. He had worked through worse, but as the days passed, the cough worsened. It lingered in his chest, making his every movement feel heavier. Murphy noticed before Thomas did. One evening, as Thomas sat down by the fire, Murphy climbed onto his lap, something he never did. He had long since learned that Thomas preferred his space, but this time, he pressed close, letting out a small, concerned whine. "Ah, you daft creature," Thomas murmured, rubbing his head. "I'm fine." But Murphy didn't move. His warm body against Thomas's chest seemed to say, "No, you're not." Over the next week, the illness deepened its hold. The forge became harder to manage, and simple tasks left Thomas exhausted. By the time the fever set in, he could barely stand. Murphy became his shadow in an even more desperate way. He refused to leave Thomas's side, pacing anxiously when Thomas struggled to get up, whining when he lay coughing in his chair. One night, Thomas barely had the strength to rise from his seat. He was too weak to make it to bed, slumping forward, his breath ragged. Murphy let out a sharp bark, a sound full of panic. He nudged Thomas with his nose, pawing at his chest as if trying to wake him. When that didn't work, he raced to the door, scratching at it furiously. Murphy had never left the cottage alone. But that night, driven by something deeper than instinct, he bolted into the cold. He ran through the snow-covered village, his small paws kicking up ice, his breath coming in frantic huffs. He barked and whined outside the apothecary's door, scratching desperately until the man inside, Mr. Holloway, opened it. "Murphy?" The old healer blinked in confusion, then frowned. "What's the matter, boy?" Murphy didn't hesitate. He turned and ran back toward the cottage, pausing only to look back, making sure Holloway was following. When the healer arrived, he found Thomas slumped in his chair, barely conscious, sweat glistening on his fevered brow. Murphy sat at his feet, his whole body tense with worry. "You clever beast," Holloway murmured before getting to work. Holloway stayed through the night, tending to Thomas with warm broths and bitter medicines. Murphy never moved from his spot, eyes locked on his master's pale face. At one point in the haze of fever, Thomas opened his eyes and saw Murphy watching him. You called for help, didn't you?" His voice was hoarse, weak. "You stubborn thing." Murphy let out a soft whine and pressed his head against Thomas's hand. Thomas managed the faintest of smiles before slipping back into sleep. It took days for the fever to break, and in that time, Murphy refused to leave Thomas's side. He barely ate, barely slept, just curled close, his watchful eyes never straying. When Thomas finally regained enough strength to sit up on his own, Murphy let out a long, relieved sigh and placed his head in Thomas's lap. "You saved me, didn't you?" Thomas murmured, running a weak hand through Murphy's fur. The little dog closed his eyes, content now that his master was safe. And in that moment, Thomas understood something he had never truly admitted before. Murphy wasn't just a companion. He was his guardian, his family, his reason to keep moving forward. And for the first time in years, Thomas realized he wasn't afraid of needing someone, because Murphy needed him just as much. The fever had passed, but Thomas was not the same man he had been before it struck. He had always been strong, enduring long days at the forge without complaint, but now he felt the weight of his years pressing down on him. His movements were slower, his breath shorter, and there was a deep lingering fatigue that no amount of rest could chase away. Murphy sensed it. The little dog never left Thomas's side, not for a moment. If Thomas moved, Murphy moved with him. If Thomas sat, Murphy curled against his feet. And at night, when Thomas coughed in his sleep, Murphy woke with a start, pressing close as if willing his master to stay. But time was relentless, and though neither of them wanted to admit it, it was running out. It was early spring when Thomas finally gathered enough strength to go on a walk again. The village was quiet that morning, the streets still damp from the melting snow. The air smelled fresh, filled with the promise of new life. But to Thomas, it felt different. As they strolled through the familiar paths, Murphy trotted beside him, his head high, his tail wagging slightly. But his steps were slower, as if he too understood that this walk was not like the others. They passed the bakery where the baker waved. They passed the blacksmith shop, where Thomas had once stood strong, hammering steel as Murphy watched from his usual corner. And then, without thinking, Thomas turned toward the churchyard. Murphy hesitated at the gate. He had never been inside before. Thomas placed a hand on his head. "Come on, boy," he murmured. And together, they stepped through. They walked in silence between the weathered headstones, the earth soft beneath their feet. Finally, Thomas stopped in front of a simple, unadorned grave. Margaret's. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the name carved into the stone. His hand rested on Murphy's back, steadying himself. "You'd have liked her," Thomas said finally, his voice quiet. "She would have spoiled you something awful." Murphy sat beside him, his ears twitching at the sound of his master's voice. "I always thought I'd end up here alone," Thomas continued, rubbing Murphy's fur absent-mindedly. "But you changed that?" Murphy looked up at him, and in his dark eyes there was something deep and knowing. Thomas exhaled. "I'm tired, boy." Murphy pressed his head against Thomas's leg, and for a long time, they stayed like that. Just an old man and his dog, standing in the quiet embrace of the past. That evening, Thomas was more tired than usual. He sat in his chair by the fire. Murphy curled at his feet. His breath was slow, deep, as if each inhale took effort. "You've been the best thing to happen to me, you know," he murmured, running a hand through Murphy's fur. "Didn't think I needed anyone. Didn't think anyone needed me. But you..." He trailed off, his eyes growing heavy. Murphy, sensing something was different, let out a soft whine. He shifted closer, pressing his body against Thomas's legs, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his master's breathing. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and as the night deepened, Thomas's breaths became softer, quieter, until finally, they faded altogether. Murphy lifted his head. He nudged Thomas's hand. No response. He let out a small, confused whimper and nudged him again. Still nothing. Murphy's ears flattened. His tail lowered. Slowly, he climbed onto Thomas's lap, curling into a tight ball, pressing his small body against the man who had been his whole world. And there he stayed, through the night, through the quiet, through the grief that he could not understand, but somehow deeply felt. His master was gone. But Murphy wasn't ready to leave him, not yet, not ever. Morning came, but Murphy did not move. He lay curled in Thomas's lap, as still as the man himself, as if by sheer will he could keep him warm, keep him here. But warmth had left, and Thomas's chest no longer rose and fell with steady breath. When the villagers arrived later that morning, drawn by the silence where there should have been the usual hammering from the forge, they found him as he was, peaceful, as if merely resting, with Murphy draped over his legs, unmoving. The apothecary, Mr. Holloway, knelt beside the chair, pressing gentle fingers to Thomas's wrist. He sighed, though he had expected this for some time. "He's gone," he murmured. The room fell silent, save for the soft crackling of the dying fire. But then, a sound, small, broken. Murphy whined, lifting his head as if only now realizing the truth. He nudged Thomas's hand once more, just to be sure. Then again. When nothing happened, the whine turned into a long, sorrowful howl. It was the kind of sound that made even the hardest men swallow down a lump in their throat. The village came together to bury Thomas, just as they had when Margaret had passed years ago. He had been a quiet man, gruff in his ways, but he had been good. He had been theirs. The grave was dug beside Margaret's, as it should be. The villagers gathered, murmuring prayers, offering their last words of farewell. But there was one mourner who would not leave. Murphy sat by the fresh mound of earth, refusing to move, even when the others began to drift away. "Come on, boy," the baker coaxed gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Murphy did not stir. His dark eyes remained fixed on the grave, his small body tense with quiet, unshakable grief. Mr. Holloway sighed. "He's not going anywhere," he murmured. And he was right. As the sun set and the village quieted, Murphy remained. The first night was the coldest it had been in weeks, but Murphy did not leave. He curled himself against the base of the gravestone, shivering slightly, but unwilling to move. The wind howled through the churchyard, rustling the bare branches above. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The night stretched long and empty, but Murphy did not waver. His ears perked at every sound, as if hoping for a familiar voice to call him home. But no voice came, and so he stayed. In the days that followed, the villagers tried to bring Murphy back. They tempted him with food, with warm blankets, with the promise of a new home. The baker even tried carrying him, only for Murphy to slip from her arms the moment she set him down, running straight back to the grave. "He's grieving," Mr. Holloway said, "just like the rest of us." But there was something deeper in Murphy's mourning, something no one could understand. He had lost the only thing that had ever been his, and no matter how long it took, he would not leave Thomas's side. Days turned into weeks, and still, Murphy remained. The cemetery caretaker, moved by the little dog's devotion, began leaving out bowls of food and water. At night, he would check in on him, finding Murphy curled up against the gravestone, his small body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The villagers, too, took to visiting. They spoke softly to him, though he never lifted his head. Children would come and sit with him, offering quiet company. But Murphy did not acknowledge them. His eyes remained fixed on the earth beneath him, as if waiting for it to stir, waiting for Thomas to come back. And so, through the passing days, through the changing of the seasons, the people of the village bore witness to a devotion unlike any they had ever known. Murphy was not simply mourning, he was keeping watch. For no matter how much time passed in his heart, Thomas was still his. And Murphy would never leave him. Time pressed forward, but Murphy did not. Spring warmed the earth, melting the last of the winter frost, and yet Murphy remained curled by Thomas's grave, his small body a permanent fixture in the churchyard. Rain fell, soaking him to the bone. The summer sun beat down, making the stones too hot to touch. But through it all, he stayed. The village, touched by his devotion, did what they could. The cemetery caretaker, a gentle old man named Alfred, became Murphy's quiet guardian. Each morning, he would fill a small dish with water and leave scraps of food just within reach. Sometimes Murphy would eat. Other times, he ignored it completely, his head resting on the mound of earth as if he still expected Thomas's hand to reach down and ruffle his fur. "He's waiting," Alfred told Mr. Holloway one evening as they watched from a distance. "For what?" Alfred exhaled, shaking his head. "For something that won't come." The baker tried too. She brought fresh bread, coaxing Murphy with soft words and outstretched hands. "Come on, love," she murmured, breaking a piece off and setting it before him. "Let's get you home." But Murphy did not lift his head. Children would sit by the grave, talking to him as they played, but the dog never joined them. He was there, but he was not there. And the village slowly came to accept that no matter how much kindness they showed, Murphy had already chosen where he belonged. Murphy's life became as steady as the rising sun. Each morning he woke as the church bells rang. He stretched, shook the dust from his fur, then settled back down by Thomas's grave, pressing close to the stone. Villagers would pass through, offering quiet words and gentle glances. Alfred left food. The baker whispered promises of warmth. And yet, Murphy's answer was always the same. He stayed. When the sky darkened and the village settled into the hush of evening, Murphy curled up beneath the gravestone, his small body fitting into the dip he had made in the grass. And when night came, he kept his silent vigil, listening for a voice that would never call him home again. As the seasons passed, the village learned to weave Murphy's presence into their lives. In the summer, the children would bring him cool water and lay in the shade beside him, speaking in soft voices so as not to disturb his silent watch. In the autumn, the butcher set aside extra scraps, slipping them into a small dish when no one was looking. And when winter came again, Alfred placed an old blanket near the grave, though Murphy never moved to take it. He endured, just as Thomas had once endured. Loyal, unshaken, unmoving. And through it all, the villagers whispered of his devotion. "That dog loved him more than anything in the world," the baker would say, shaking her head. "A heart like that doesn't break easy," Mr. Holloway would reply. And as the years began to pass, Murphy's story became more than just a tale of grief. It became a lesson, a truth whispered from parent to child. Love endures. Love remembers. Love does not leave, even when the world says it must. And so, Murphy stayed. For Thomas. For the love that had given him a home. For the only place he had ever belonged. The years stretched on, but Murphy remained. His once young body grew leaner, his steps slower, his fur streaked with gray. But still, he did not leave. The villagers no longer tried to take him home. They understood now. Murphy had a home. It was here, beside Thomas, and no force, not time nor weather, nor the gentle hands that had tried to coax him away, could change that. The second winter after Thomas's passing was the harshest the village had seen in years. The snow came early and heavy, blanketing the churchyard in white, turning the headstones into silent, frozen sentinels. Murphy was not as strong as he once was. His legs, once swift and sure, trembled as he walked. His breath came in slow, heavy puffs of steam against the cold air. Alfred, the cemetery caretaker, had grown increasingly worried. One evening, as the sun sank low, he approached with an old woolen blanket and a piece of salted meat. "You're getting too old for this, boy," Alfred murmured, crouching beside the dog. Murphy barely lifted his head. "You don't have to do this anymore," Alfred continued, his voice as soft as the falling snow. "Thomas wouldn't want you suffering." Murphy did not move. Alfred exhaled, placing the blanket close. "At least take the warmth, lad." Murphy did not. Instead, he pressed himself closer to the headstone, letting the cold settle around him. Alfred stood in silence for a long moment before finally walking away, his heart heavy. Winter eventually loosened its grip, and spring returned, breathing warmth back into the land. The earth softened. The trees stretched their limbs toward the sun. And still, Murphy stayed. The villagers continued to care for him in small ways, leaving food, speaking kind words, offering gentle touches when he allowed it. But Murphy was changing. His once bright eyes dulled. His walks grew shorter. He no longer raised his head at the sound of children laughing or wagged his tail at the familiar faces of the townsfolk. It was as if something deep within him was fading, and the village knew. His time was drawing near. One warm afternoon, a young boy named Peter, no more than 8 years old, came to the graveyard. He had been visiting Murphy for months now, often sitting beside him, whispering stories, stroking his fur when the old dog allowed it. That day, he brought a small piece of bread from the bakery and sat cross-legged beside Murphy. "You don't eat much anymore," Peter murmured, breaking off a tiny piece and setting it beside him. Murphy did not move. Peter sighed. "Mama says you must have loved him a lot." The boy glanced at the gravestone, tracing Thomas's name with his fingers. "Must be nice," Peter whispered, more to himself than to Murphy. "Having someone love you that much." Murphy let out a slow breath, shifting slightly. The boy reached out and gently stroked his fur. "You don't have to wait anymore, Murphy," Peter said softly. "He wouldn't leave you behind. Maybe he's waiting for you now." Murphy's ears twitched, but he did not lift his head. Peter sat with him until the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the grass. And when he finally rose to leave, he glanced back just once. Murphy hadn't moved, but for the first time in a long while, The old dog looked peaceful, as if at last he had made his decision. And soon, the village would understand what Murphy had known all along. Love never truly leaves, it only waits. The sun rose and fell over the village, but Murphy barely stirred. His body, once lean and strong, had grown frail with time, and his once alert eyes now carried the weight of years. He still lay beside Thomas's grave, as he always had, but his breathing was slower now, his movements fewer. The village knew. The children who once tried to coax him away no longer did. The baker no longer set out fresh bread, knowing Murphy would not eat it. And Alfred, the caretaker, watched over him in quiet understanding. The little dog who had once been so full of life was nearing the end of his journey. Peter, the young boy who had spent many afternoons at Murphy's side, returned to the graveyard at dusk, just as the last rays of light painted the sky in gold and violet. Murphy was there, as always, but tonight, something was different. His body was still, save for the slow rise and fall of his breath. His head rested against the base of Thomas's gravestone, and his ears, once always perked at the sound of footsteps, remained still. Peter sat beside him and gently placed a hand on Murphy's thin frame. "You're tired, aren't you?" the boy whispered. Murphy let out a slow exhale, a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the years he had waited. Peter swallowed past the lump in his throat. He didn't want Murphy to go, but he also knew that love meant letting go when it was time. "You don't have to wait anymore," Peter murmured. "You've done enough." The old dog didn't move. For the first time in years, Murphy wasn't keeping watch. He was resting. The next morning, Alfred found Murphy just as Peter had left him, curled at the foot of Thomas's grave, peaceful, as if he had simply drifted to sleep. The old caretaker knelt beside him, running a gentle hand through Murphy's fur. "You were a good lad," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "The best there ever was." The village grieved in their own way. The baker wiped at her eyes as she kneaded dough, remembering the little dog who once trotted through the streets with his master. The blacksmith's apprentice stood outside the forge in silence, knowing the place would never feel quite the same again. And Peter, the boy who had been Murphy's last companion, visited the grave that afternoon and sat beside it, just as Murphy once had. "You're with him now," he whispered. "I know you are." A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the scent of spring. And somehow, Peter knew Murphy was finally home. The townspeople, moved by the little dog's devotion, decided that Murphy's story should never be forgotten. With great care, Alfred and a few others carved a small marker beside Thomas's grave. It wasn't grand, just a simple stone with a few words. But it was enough. Murphy, a loyal friend, a faithful heart, forever at his master's side. And so, the little dog who had once been nothing but a stray, the dog who had loved without end, became more than just a memory. He became a legend, a story passed from parent to child, from villager to traveler, from those who had seen his devotion with their own eyes to those who would one day hear of it. For love like Murphy's never truly fades. It lives on in the hearts of those who remember. Spring breathed new life into the village, but something felt different. There was an emptiness in the churchyard where Murphy had once been, a quiet absence that even the gentle rustling of the trees could not fill. For the first time in years, the grave stood alone. No small figure curled at its base, no soft breathing in the still of the night. Murphy was gone, but his presence lingered. People still walked by the churchyard each morning, pausing for a moment at the two graves, Thomas's and the smaller stone beside it. Some brought flowers, not just for Thomas, but for the little dog who had refused to leave his side. Children who had once sat beside Murphy and whispered their stories, now whispered about him. They say he waited for years," a young girl told her friend. "And that Thomas finally came back for him," the other replied in a hushed voice. Though Murphy was gone, his story lived on, woven into the fabric of the village like an old, cherished tale. And the village, though mourning him, found comfort in the thought that somewhere, somehow, Murphy and Thomas were together again. If there is a place beyond this world, a place where bonds are never broken, then that is where Murphy ran to. In that place, the air was warm, filled with the scent of earth and rain. The wind carried no chill, only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of someone long missed. Murphy blinked as he stood in the middle of a vast field, the golden light stretching endlessly before him. He lifted his nose, inhaling deeply. A scent? Familiar? His ears perked, his tail twitched, and then a voice. "Come here, boy." Murphy turned, and there he was. Thomas stood in the distance, his hand outstretched, his face young and strong again, the way he had been in Murphy's earliest memories. Murphy didn't hesitate. With one final burst of energy, his old legs became swift again, his frail body replaced by the strength of youth. His paws kicked up dust as he ran, faster and faster, his heart hammering with only one thought: home. And as he reached Thomas, as warm hands ruffled through his fur and a familiar voice murmured, "There you are, lad," Murphy knew. This time, Thomas would never leave, and neither would he. The days after Murphy's passing were quiet. The village had lost one of its own, and though he had been just a small dog, his absence was felt as deeply as if he had been one of their own kin. But as with all things, life moved on. The forge roared with new apprentices, the baker continued kneading her bread, and children ran through the streets, their laughter carrying on the wind. Yet, something had changed. Murphy's story had become part of the village itself. One morning, Alfred, the cemetery caretaker, gathered a few of the townspeople together. With the help of the blacksmith's apprentice and the stonemason, they erected a small statue beside Thomas's grave, a simple carving of a dog curled up at rest, head on his paws, forever keeping watch. It wasn't grand, it wasn't extravagant, but it was right. Beneath it, they inscribed a few simple words: Murphy, forever at his master's side. It was all that needed to be said. And from that day on, no one passed through the churchyard without stopping to pay their respects. Murphy's tale spread far beyond the village. Travelers passing through would pause at the cemetery, asking about the faithful dog who had waited years for his master. Parents told the story to their children, who, in turn, would one day tell their own. By the fire, in the bakery, in the forge, his name lived on. He waited for him, they would say. Through rain and snow, through years and years, he never left. And that, they knew, was the truest kind of love. Seasons passed. The village changed, as all places do. Houses were rebuilt, roads widened, new faces replaced the old. But one thing remained unchanged. Murphy's statue still stood, nestled between Thomas's grave and Margaret's. The stone, though weathered, still bore his name, a quiet testament to love, devotion, and a bond that had never broken. And even generations later, children would run their fingers over the inscription, their voices hushed in wonder. "Do you think he ever found him?" one would ask. And the answer was always the same. He never had to look. Thomas was waiting for him, just like Murphy had waited here. For love like theirs was never truly lost. It only waited to be found again. The years passed. The seasons changed. The village grew and shifted, its people coming and going like the tide. But some stories refused to fade. Murphy's statue stood as a quiet guardian in the churchyard. His name worn smooth by time, but never forgotten. Flowers were left at his feet by those who had heard his tale, whispered from mother to child, from elder to youth. And though no one ever saw him again on certain evenings, when the sky blushed gold and the wind carried the scent of rain, some swore they heard it, a soft rustling of paws through the grass, a distant joyful bark, a whisper of devotion that time itself could not silence. In a place beyond the reach of pain, beyond the weight of sorrow, where the rivers ran clear and the hills stretched endless beneath the warm sun, a man stood waiting. Thomas, his hands rested in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the horizon, watching. And then, a shape in the distance. A small figure running with all the speed of youth, his ears flapping in the wind, his paws kicking up dust as he raced forward. Thomas smiled. "There you are, boy." Murphy leaped into his arms, his tail wagging so hard it sent dust flying. Thomas let out a deep, rumbling laugh, the first he had felt in years. No, in lifetimes. Strong hands ruffled through Murphy's fur, pulling him close, holding him in the embrace he had longed for. "You waited for me," Thomas murmured, pressing his forehead gently to Murphy's. Murphy only whined softly, nuzzling closer, as if to say, of course I did." And in that moment, the weight of years fell away. There was no more waiting, no more cold nights, no more sorrow. Just a man and his dog walking side by side once more, together in a world where love was never lost, only found again, and this time it was forever. Loyalty like Murphy's isn't taught, it's felt. If you've ever had a furry companion who never gave up on you, who stayed by your side and waited for you until the end of time, please like and subscribe in their honor.